All right. So once again, welcome everyone. We have Neil Schulman here, who has been paddling since he was 6 years old and with Oops for not quite as long. But since Bill Clinton was in the White House, according to your bio, and lots of different types of kayaking, sea kayaking, whitewater, kayak polo, other outdoor adventures, and also is an experienced photographer. And so we're excited to see your pictures and learn from you. Again, folks, if you have any questions, we'll pause at one point and I'll read the ones that are in the chat and try to kind of group ones together. We'll also allow you to unmute yourself and ask questions. So Neil, it's over to you.
Thanks, everyone. It's unfortunate that we can't do this in person over beer, but that probably does make it easier for some of the folks I know from BC and elsewhere to be here. So thank you. And it's thanks to Jennifer also from not sharing all the information about when I was in the witness protection program, which is of course where I know Fred and Tim and Dick and Karen from. Those aren't their real names. No, in all seriousness, it's fun to do this.
I know.
The format is a little funky, obviously, for people who know me well. I like to kind of create lots of activities and have people do stuff in groups and things like that. We're not going to try and do that because Zoom isn't really super conducive to that, and especially with this many people, but I'm going to try and keep this relatively short so we can have a couple of breaks for questions and we can stop. And if people have questions, you don't have to wait for a break. You can just raise your hand or your digital hand or whatever, just blurt something out. People who know me well, when I get going, I can potentially talk the paint off the wall. So I'm trying to keep this relatively short. But the main thing is that, and I'm going to start sharing my screen now, I guess. And that means I can't see you as well. So just be aware of that. You should see the first slide, like the title slide. If you can't, Jennifer, let me know if I did it wrong.
We can see it. You're good.
Okay. So this is kind of designed to be kayak photography, sort of made simple or made as simple as possible. A couple of caveats is really kayak photography is not that different from any other kind of photography. It's pretty there, but also this is not really designed to be about like f-stops and shutter speeds and what setting to use on your camera, because the camera manuals do a better job of explaining that than I can, and that's less fun. So really what I wanted to start out with was with, where's my advanced button? A little bit about me, basically. So I started paddling when I was a kid. I started photographing when I was a kid. I do multiple kinds of photography. So I do outdoor stuff where you have a little, like a small camera in my PFD pocket, and I do stuff where I'm hauling around a bunch of lenses and a tripod and everything in between. I do sea kayaking. I do whitewater. I play kayak polo, which is absolutely absurd. And I photograph all of those to some degree, and they're all a little different. But I'm going to touch base on the basics of it. And again, really, it's not about how, it's more about what and why. And the goal is really just to give everybody some things to think about. The other thing I always tell people is I have a very firm non-discrimination policy when it comes to equipment. I don't care if you're using your phone or a digital point and shoot or super fancy digital camera, or it doesn't really GoPro, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters, but it doesn't matter. You can make them do any of those things, do what you want. The thing you should not do if you want to take better photos is just run out and spend a bunch of money on gear. Eventually that may limit you, but ultimately it's really more what you do with the equipment that you have than anything else. So don't worry too much about like, can I do this with my phone? The answer is probably yes. Now I have to figure out why this isn't advancing. Sorry guys, hang on one second.
You might have to use like the space bar on your keyboard or your.
Oh, there we go. It's the space bar. Okay. I start out with this picture because this photo was a shot I took several years ago. That was a very important shot for me. And you know, it had a particular place and a particular time and a particular meaning. It's a really boring photo. It's just a photo of some guy's feet with their legs kind of out of focus in front of a rock. And there's nothing really that's going to say to anybody other than me anything important. Yeah, there's a boat in the distance. Yeah, it's kind of a partly cloudy sky and it's clearly low tide. But that really doesn't really convey anything to anybody else looking at it. And that's the first place to start with photographs in general, and kayaking photographs in particular, is you're trying to communicate something, hopefully, and it's got to make sense to whoever the viewer is. And this makes sense only to me, which means it's not a great photo. And we all have lots of photos, myself included, of like where you can't really tell what's going on or why it's important and things like that. For those of you who know me, there's also a game I like to play, and this applies to today, which is you get 1 point if you can guess where, for every photo, you can guess where it's taken. Any guesses?
San Juan's.
Nope. We can put our guesses in the chat so it doesn't slow us down. But this is up in BC. This is up in Clayoquot, actually. So you get 1 point every time you get it right. The points are not redeemable for anything. It's just to make you famous. So we have to find other ways, make sure that photographs communicate in some way to other people, not just us. And sometimes it's about mood. We all have plenty of photos of our kayaks on the beach in various places. This one conveys a little bit of something through the light and the fog and the placement of the objects and things like that. This one obviously conveys something very different. It's not about mood, it's about intensity and activity and what those folks are doing. We have to use both composition and light to turn a still two-dimensional space into a space that feels like it has depth and movement. So that means composition, framing, light management, things like that. But far too many photos look like this. This is a photo of a guy paddling below snow-capped mountains, but that's really all it tells you. If you know that person, it's probably significant. If you don't, it's probably not. You could put this on like your generic travel brochure, but it's really not going to evoke any particular emotion or feeling or mood or anything like that. So the first question I always ask is, when you look at a photo, what is it about? And that is sometimes literal and sometimes not. This is another example of what I consider a fairly failed shot. You get the sense that there's water of different colors and texture meeting, and that there's some big mountains, but you don't really know why you should care or what you should feel about it. Now I'm going to add, this is one of the audience participation parts, as best we can manage this on Zoom. I'm going to go through a sequence of photos, and I'm just going to ask you to blurt out verbally rather than in chat, because I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen, what you are getting, what you get from these various images. And here's the first one. And now it's not letting me, oh, there we go. Yep, that one.
Intensity.
Intensity,
Concentration.
concentration,
Focus.
focus. Yeah, pretty easy to land on a quick set of themes there. And there seems to be a delay when I try and advance here.
Can you use your like forward arrow or up arrow?
Yeah, it just seems to always, sorry, Jennifer, it always seems to switch. Like one time, one key will work and then it won't work the next time. What about this one?
End of a long day.
A wet day.
End of a long day, a wet day,
It's campy.
campy,
The grapes of wrath.
the grapes of wrath. That's okay. I didn't know that one.
The calm after the storm.
Yeah, maybe the calm after the storm. This is actually my second best selling kayak image, even though the only thing about it that tells you it's even about kayaking is the presence of a paddle. So it doesn't really tell a story so much as it evokes a feeling. And that's part of what photos are designed to do. Tim, you can probably get a point for this, for knowing where this is, I'm assuming.
Ooh,
Solitude.
Solitude, could be.
Exploration.
Relay scattering.
Yeah, there you go. There's definitely some Rayleigh scattering going on. That's part of the technical presentation that we won't get to today.
Introspection.
Yeah, introspection. The friend of mine, who I'm sure somebody you know, Kevin, who is in the photo, the guy in the photo, his comment was like, "This seems like it should be one of those motivational posters that are on office walls. It's about like self-awareness or meditation or something like that." But yeah, so anyway, you're getting themes out of these things that are about more than this is where I went on Thursday or this is what this beach looks like. So they're more evocative and less narrative. So one of the things I hope you leave with today is just some ideas about how to start to do that. And the biggest one is to understand that the basic ingredient of photography is light. And if there's no light, there's no photo. And if there's boring light, there's probably a boring photo. And there's lots of different kinds of light and lots of different ways to manage it. And the first thing that we all probably learned about photography is that light is best at sunrise and sunset. That is actually a lie. Whoever told you that was close. It's actually best right before sunset. This was actually taken when it was still mostly dark, just before sunrise, and just after sunset, and then a little after that when it gets dark. If you're doing night photography, that's actually where the light, I consider the light to be better, is going to be in the hour before sunrise and the hour after sunset, what I call the blue hours, where the blue and yellow and the pink all intersect. And that is going to be the sweet spot for kind of that rich kind of light that we, kind of see in a lot of pictures that are designed to look really cool and dramatic and warm, or that mixing of warm and cool. The other things to know about light is that is usually not when we are out paddling. We are usually out, we usually wake up, we have coffee, we spend 15 minutes trying to remember how we pack our boat. Then we actually pack our boat, and we're usually paddling when the light is more like the light in the photos. If it's a sunny day, hey Fred, look, that's you in the background there. If it is a sunny day, like the picture in the upper left, you're going to have a lot of contrast. You're going to have a really hard time making things look welcoming. It's really easy for direct light to look harsh. And then you add the fact that people are wearing hats and helmets with brims and their faces are in shadow. And your eyes might be able to handle it, but the camera's not as good as your eyes, so it can't. So you end up with a lot of pretty unflattering photos that aren't very appealing. If you have a cloudy day, like your fairly typical Pacific Northwest gray day, or in the case of the bottom right, your fairly typical Alaska gray day, you're gonna have a lot of boring gray sky, and no matter how much you try and bring those highlights back in that gray sky, like I did in post-processing here, it's still gonna look pretty muddy and gummy and gray. So the fact that we are usually not out paddling when the light is good doesn't work in our favor and does not make our jobs easier. So that is one reason to wake up early or stay out late, or to find ways around that. One of the ways to find around that is to go out on the edges of crappy weather. That is when you're going to get rainbows. That's the rain part. But the weak edges and sides and beginnings and ends of storm systems and funky cloud banks and places where there's usually a lot of wind and heavy rain and sometimes thunder and lightning, which are always great to paddle in, are also good times to get, if you're lucky and in the right place at the right time, get some dramatic lighting. Light also creates mood as well as just illuminates the subject and just, creates color and that sort of thing. So when you see a certain light pattern, what I always think of is, how do I match it to the landscape? And what do I do? What kind of mood is it going to give me? This is kind of like that kind of mysterious kind of mood. Sometimes it's a really soft, easy, kind of no shadows type mood. That's the nice thing about things like snow, or in this case, sand, is that it reflects a lot of light and takes care of those shadows for you. Sometimes, again, that rich sunset light, if you can actually get somebody to go out paddling at that time of night, which I always encourage. And then there's other things like, how do you make the light look illuminating or inspirational or create a certain emotion around discovery or things like that? So those are all kind of things with light. Light also creates texture. Shooting texture is one of the things you can always do on like days where the sky is really boring or things like that, but you still need to think about what that light is going to give you. And sometimes it is perfectly appropriate if you want to create rich colors, lots of contrast, lots of drama, to shoot in the middle of a sunny day, because you'll get deep blacks, you'll get really bright whites, you'll have really rich colors, and a lot of contrast, and that can create drama too. So these are all, think of light as a tool and part of your raw material, and then just kind of figure out what you want to do with it. And again, we haven't even turned on your camera yet or taken your phone out of your pocket yet. This is all just looking around. And light also has a huge effect on people. When shooting people in different kind of light is kind of funny. We all think it's fun. We always think of portrait light as this really kind of soft light that makes everybody look 30 years younger than they are, but sometimes that's not what you're going for. A couple of places you should really learn, light patterns you should really learn if you're going to paddle and shoot, that you should learn to handle and how to handle. One of them is sunrise and sunset, which means you're going to be shooting a lot of silhouettes. The other one is when you get diffraction sunbeams, where they're coming through clouds, coming through trees. How do you make the camera render those the way you want? The other one is fog burning off. We all are going to see that on the coast. And that to me is one of my favorite times to shoot, where, first it's gray and then the landscape starts to reveal itself and then it looks a little gauzy. Um, so fog, learn how to manage fog as it burns off. The hardest light to manage, and you can't really do this without a little bit of correction in some sort of computer program, no matter what you do, is shooting in sea caves. For those of you who are venturing into those places, they're by far my favorite type of paddling, is to go out into rock gardens. And caves are amazing. And what you're trying to capture is so much more than visual. It's the smells, the sound of the waves booming in the caves and echoing out of the back of the cave, and the fact that you don't know what's behind you, and you're waiting to see what happens when a big set of swells rolls through. There's a lot going on there, both in a photo and just in the sensory overload that is really hard to convey through a photo. And then you have all of this light coming in through entrances, and it's really hard to manage. But if you're going to venture into sea caves, it's a phenomenal opportunity to shoot, as long as you can learn how to manage it. The other ones are, again, kind of weak spots in storm systems. So that's what gives you those kind of crepuscular rays on the left, or obviously rainbows at the edges of a rain system. The rainbow will obviously always be opposite the sun. Those are just situations that, as paddlers, we know we're going to see, and from a photography standpoint, you want to be ready for. And then the other one is a sunstar. These are actually if you have enough manual control over your gear, which means you probably can't do this on a phone, although I've never tried, and maybe you can. Those sunstar effects are actually relatively straightforward to create, and they can be really cool. And the other thing to get used to is use the silhouette. It is inevitable, shooting in the amount of light that we go out in on bright days or sunset, that we're going to be shooting silhouettes. And silhouettes are really fun. It just reduces things to shape. And if you can combine a silhouette with a sunstar, then you've got something. And if you can combine a silhouette, a sunstar, and a reflective surface that bounces light back around and creates more exposure latitude, then that can be really fun too. Snow is great for that, but water can be pretty good too, depending on how still it is. So a couple of other tips, just to kind of, so one of them is learn how to manage light. The other basic thing I always tell people is tip number 2 is get closer. I don't care where you are, you probably need to get closer. We all have pictures of paddling that are just too far away to be meaningful. You can crop them, but it's not going to be as good as actually getting closer, either with by moving or using a zoom lens, or both. Usually moving is better. And no matter what the subject is, chances are you have room in the frame that is not being well used. That's my niece. This is a little bit of an example of getting closer. What's the main story here? It's not the paddler, it's actually the water. And in this case, my lens is about, 6 inches from the actual, from the water, shooting really wide angle. So get closer. And this works for landscapes too. You don't have to show the whole thing. In this case, the whole waterfall. It's fine that it starts and ends off the frame. Really what you're getting here is the texture of the water and the patterns of the light. You don't need the whole landscape. It's fine to just zoom in and deal with one section. The other thing you should also do is get further away. Get either, again, back up or zoom out, so you can show a whole scene with a little bit of context, and in this case with a bigger sense of motion. And again, you can do the same thing at water level. You can do the same thing with landscapes. Show the big wide expanse and the big feeling of space. What you'll notice in these things, and the ideas of getting closer and getting further away, is we are deliberately, what I find myself doing is deliberately getting into a pattern where my photographs don't just look like human vision. They are showing us something in a different way. Maybe it's zoomed in, maybe it's zoomed out, maybe compresses space, maybe it's shot in a way like this that starts to sort of make the earth and the sky feel curved, which they are. Then, you know, because the shots that look just like we see things, well, that's boring. We see things like that all the time. The other thing, and this goes to a little bit of my personal style, but I find it really works. And but my visual style is I really encourage you to put some really big and interesting and close things in the foreground. That is how you, one of the ways, not the only way, but the biggest way you can create three-dimensional depth in a two-dimensional image. And that helps with a sense of motion, it helps with a sense of distance, it helps with a sense of context about the place. And you can do this in any different way, but think first about the foreground and then maybe build the rest of the frame around that. And again, you don't have to have a person or a kayak in there. You can do it with landscape elements too. A little bit of word to the wise when we're doing kayak photography, especially sea kayaks, we have this giant bow that's always in front of us. It's really tempting to use that as your foreground anchor. I try and do that relatively sparingly just because it's been done so much that you can only have get away with so many shots of your bow pointing at something interesting. Before everyone's tired of seeing the bow of your kayak. It's really like, okay, that's enough of that. So I'm going to just pause here and see if there are any questions so far. And we can see what's in the chat, Jennifer.
So Neil, so far in the chat, there aren't any questions, but I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the one where we're seeing your bow, you're in your boat, but how many of these photos when you're in the water, are you in the water or are you out on shore, and kind of how do you manage the stability of your boat and your camera at the same time?
Yes, the answer is I would say I shoot from all kinds of different positions. Everyone, you know, I would say about half of these shots are shot in my kayak and about half of them are shot on shore. More of the whitewater shots are taken on shore just because in whitewater, it is relatively easy to find an eddy pop out of your boat. Whereas if you're in the middle of the Columbia River, you're pretty much not doing that. So most of my sea kayaking shots are taken with a point and shoot that is on my PFD, not all of them, in my PFD that I can just pop in and out quickly. How do I manage this stability? There's really kind of two ways. One of them is, or three answers to that. One of them is you just get used to it. You know, like I usually have one hand on my paddle and one hand on my camera. The other one is I have some pre-programmed settings into the camera that I most frequently use, so that I know that if I just spin the dial to this, it's going to be preset to have a relatively fast shutter speed and be able to absorb if there's waves, the bouncing up and down of the waves. And, you know, with digital, I can take a bunch of shots and not worry that I'm wasting money on film like I used to. And the third one is sometimes it doesn't work. And there's people in this room that have seen me get taken out by waves that I wasn't looking for because I was looking through the camera lens. But that has happened on occasion too. But that's really kind of the trick, as simple as it is for me. You know, I find big cameras in dynamic water are just too much to manage. So I use an Olympus little point and shoot that's about the size of a deck of cards that has decent camera quality, but not great. But then it's always with you. Sometimes I use a GoPro, but less often. For whitewater or things where I know I'm going to be able to get out, I'll throw a digital SLR in a Pelican case or a waterproof bag and just pull over to shore. But so a lot of these are taken on the water with a digital point and shoot, but some of them aren't.
Great, thanks. There is a question which I think you might have just answered, but in the chat, wondering what your favorite type of camera is when you're on the water. Point and shoot, GoPro. It sounds like your point and shoot's kind of your go-to, but
Yeah, the digital point and shoot that I use is kind of the go-to, and part of that is because it's small enough to fit in my PFD, and it is reasonably quick, reasonably decent quality. It definitely makes some compromises, but I still use other stuff too.
Mhm. Great. And it looks like Horst, you have your hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, I have a question about when you shoot photos with a GoPro. I got a GoPro like 9 months ago, and I'm using it mostly on whitewater for video. So, but I have explored voice commands. So my question is about how do you trigger the shutter? Manually with a button, voice commands, or if you're using a remote control or other means?
I tried the voice control once. I found myself just screaming at it and ready to, like, I hate that. It didn't really seem to work very well. I am triggering, usually I have it mounted on a suction cup mount that mounts to the deck. And I'm just triggering, reaching, like at the bare extent of where I can reach it with my hand. And I can put it in a couple of different configurations or turn it around, but or face it different directions. And then I'm just using my hands. I kind of gave up on the voice thing. But
have you ever tried the remote control? I've only seen it advertised, and I've used it for other cameras, but
no, I guess you could. I could try it and tape it to my paddle or something like that. But that I haven't experimented with that. That seems like an excuse for another thing that would require batteries that I forget to change, but someday maybe.
Thanks.
Yeah, if anyone else has done that, that could be. I mean, I know people have. Let's put it that way. I just have not done that.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a couple other questions in the chat, and folks feel free to keep adding them or jump in with them. Alan's wondering, is a level horizon not gospel? He really enjoys the variations.
One of the things about the rules of composition is that they are not rules. No one's been fined or arrested for breaking them. You don't have to have a level horizon. There's sometimes I deliberately tilt the horizon or just don't worry about it. That's one way of conveying a dynamic sense of paddling and a dynamic landscape and creating a sense of direction. Diagonal lines have much more of a dynamic feel to them than flat lines. So no, it's not gospel, and you don't need to follow it. And again, those rules of composition are really just the suggestions of composition.
All right, rules are made to be broken, huh? Around photography, maybe not around safety gear. Tyrone's wondering, that point and shoot, is it waterproof or do you have a case for that?
This one is waterproof. I definitely break them a lot. I've had more issues with like sand getting in the mechanism, and there's plenty of waterproof ones out there. Those are kind of the only point and shoots I think that are still made are the waterproof ones, because everybody, for land stuff, people are pretty much using their phones. So the manufacturers have kind of gotten away from them, and there's only so many models out there. I find them waterproof. It's waterproof if you close it correctly, if you don't get sand in the O-ring when if your hands are dry when you're changing the batteries, et cetera, et cetera.
That's all that's in the chat. Does anyone else have a question they want to just ask out loud? And I can only see the chat and Neil in the screen. So if you're raising your physical hand, go ahead and just shout it out.
Well, I'll keep going and we can stop again. So yeah. So I'm just going to keep on going on with some things to think about. One of them is the biggest thing about photography in general is you have to simplify. Your brain being there can take in way more information and process it and get coherence out of it than any photograph can ever convey without just getting confusing and annoying for the viewer and looking like a jumble of stuff. We understand when we look at a picture if somebody's standing in front of a tree, that the tree is not actually coming out of their head, but the camera does not know that. So I always encourage people to simplify your stories, simplify your compositions, use space, use color to really keep it clean and reduce the number of elements. You will, when you're in a really cool place, there is a huge tendency to want to tell the whole story in one image. You usually can't do that. So boil it down to some sort of essence. One of the ways that I tend to simplify things is by, and you've seen a number of photos like this already, is by converting them in post-processing to black and white, because kayaking gear is really freaking colorful. And sometimes that is a distraction from things like the aerated texture of the water. And one of the ways you can manage it is to get rid of the color. That's one way of simplifying. You can also simplify it by getting rid of the background. In this case, making sure that the background is far enough away and that it can be really blurry. And all of those distracting elements in the back are going to disappear. And you're just left with the main story, which is getting schooled and trash talked by a 6-year-old.
Hey, Neil, can I jump in with a question of my own here?
Yeah.
I've noticed in a lot of your photos when you're on the water, then there's like 3 different focal points. They all seem to be in focus. And maybe I'm just using my iPhone too much. I can't seem to get like the kayaker in front of me and the mountain both focused. What's the trick?
Well, I don't shoot much with an iPhone. With a digital point and shoot, you have control over depth of field, and you have control. And so to keep it relatively simple, when you are shooting at a wide angle, the tendency is the camera will try and put everything in focus. On an iPhone, you can tap like where you want it to focus and it will focus there, but it will have relatively little latitude to keep the foreground and the background in focus if that's what you want. And again, in that past shot I just showed you, that wasn't what I wanted. You know, I wanted all of the stuff to Cedar's left to go blurry and soft. So you can do it by controlling a setting called aperture f-stop and shooting. If you shoot at a narrower opening, you will get everything in focus. If you shoot at a wide opening, you will get a very defined focus on one thing and one thing only, like you do here. The other thing you can do is make what controls focus is distance from the camera, right? So if you have one thing that's really close and one thing that's really far away, like I was encouraging you to do by saying anchor the foreground, to have them both in focus, you're gonna need to control depth of field a little bit. Phones do make that a little hard. That is one of their limitations. I think, phones are really not, I don't use a phone on a day-to-day basis most of the time. This is a simplified, shooting kayak polo is crazy because there's boats and people and balls and paddles in your way. And this is kind of zooming in really close just to try and simplify a chaotic scene with 12 people and a bunch of stuff going on, and not just have it look like a mess. So simplify composition, simplify color, simplify the story that you're trying to tell. If you're looking at a big scene and there's smells and there's sounds and there's tide pool critters and it's sunset and you just did this really long crossing and you're glad to be in camp, you can't show all that in one image. You're going to have to pick one thing. The other thing I always encourage people to do is you don't actually have to tell the whole story. Create cliffhangers, create a sense of mystery, create a sense of, I don't know what's going on, but there's a mystery that gives some sort of feeling. In this case, it's really what is going on here. There's obviously a lot of color contrast, but it's kind of hard to tell exactly what the story is, and that's okay. It gives you a feeling from the color and the patterns, and that's good enough. This creates some mystery just by being able to see the physicality and the motion, but not being able to see the face of whoever you're looking at. In this case, it's taking a shot where Lana is clearly looking at something off the frame, and we don't get to see what it is, but there's clearly something important going on over there. Deliberately losing a sense of scale. Is this a string of islands seen from an airplane? Is it a puddle on a street corner? It happens to be a puddle, a small kind of pond of sand on the beach. But the fact that you don't know what it is or can't quite understand the scale, but just have to go on the texture and the shape and the light kind of makes it more interesting. And again, we get mystery also from light patterns. And the most common one is kind of the foggy, cloudy, brooding, things partially obscured in the distance and in the foreground kind of feeling. But you can also get a sense of mystery out of a really luminous light pattern, where there's clearly something cool off in the distance there, some form of inspiration or destination, but you can't see it. It's yet to be discovered. So these are obviously kind of abstract, but that's kind of how photography can work. The other thing, and this is the hardest thing to do, is to move the camera. Typically the most boring photos, in addition to being just shot at roughly our same perspective as our eyes, in other words, not zoomed in or zoomed out, when they're shot from our natural head height, they get pretty boring pretty quick. Because again, that's how we're used to seeing things. So I'm always trying to find ways to put the camera in a way that creates an interesting perspective. And this is obviously where a waterproof camera can come in handy. Or just getting really low to the ground, or getting really high up sometimes. When you're shooting things like waves and surf, a couple of words to the wise, for this vantage, which is the safe vantage standing on the beach with your feet relatively dry, and your camera relatively dry, it takes a huge wave to actually make this look impressive. And this was a huge wave. You're going to be far better off if you can find a way to shoot from the side. That's really where you start to see the shape and size of waves relative to us puny humans and start to feel the amount of force that might be involved, or things like that. The other option that I do sometimes, and going back to Jennifer's earlier question, is I'll get in the water. And I'll shoot people paddling out through the surf from the other direction. And again, on the right, sometimes trying to figure out how to get the camera high enough to create an interesting perspective. In this case, I unfortunately allowed my right toe to sneak into the frame there. And go on, if you have a waterproof camera, use the waterproofness of it. That's what that's for. This was taken from a kayak, not like diving or anything like that. And when you're doing split shots, like trying to do split shots like this, you really want to invest in putting some Rain-X on the lens beforehand. It'll just keep the water from beating up. A little cheap trick. The other thing to look at is play with details and textures. Try and create a sense of feeling out of just visual. And again, we're usually experiencing the world with 5 senses, and photos try and reduce it to 1. So you have to play around with details and textures. That's where what your ability to control focus does become really important. There's obviously tons of textures around us. You can go macro, but that's not the only way to create texture. There's texture in water and things like that. There's texture in big, vast landscapes. And there's texture in equipment, and there's texture in different behavior in the water surfaces. Hey, look, there's Fred again. So if the light isn't cooperating, or even if it is, that's kind of the first place I go, is I look for interesting textures and just start to play around with them. The other thing is we are telling stories. And one of the things when I started doing a lot of serious photography and started to like shoot a lot of pure landscapes, people were always asking me like, don't you have pictures of people doing things? And I realized that that's a really important part of the story. And it's not necessarily like we don't go on a trip so that we can set up our tents or that sort of thing, but they are a really important way of conveying an experience, especially as not necessarily as a standalone photo, but as part of a larger story. And some cases that's by implication. You know, there's a picture of somebody doing things. We just don't know exactly what because they're doing it with their headlamp at night while I was doing night photography, and it just kind of came out cool when somebody decided they needed to wake up and get something out of their hatch. So play around with that, and that is going to usually involve people. And when you're photographing people, and I'm not like a portrait photographer, every once in a while I'll use lights, but it's really once in a blue moon. But the trick that I've learned is that you just have to be patient and put people at ease. You know, this is your standard photo of you're taking somebody's picture. They know you're taking their picture. You're getting that, hi, how are you smile. That is great for a snapshot, but it's kind of this nervous, okay, you're done taking my picture so I can go get back to what I was doing before. Okay, that's great. What I usually do is just wait, and I'll just sit there with my camera until they get tired of me waiting for me to take the picture or they think I'm done. And that's usually when they go back to doing what they were doing. And those usually produce far more interesting stories than the kind of picture where they see the camera looking at them and they're trying to look good. And that's when people let their guard down and are just being themselves. And then you get shots that convey more feeling and more emotion and more drama. And you get to see the natural vibe of people's personalities more. When people are doing stuff like playing in surf or whitewater, I usually look away from the action to see what other people are doing too. You get a lot of interesting photos that way. But you just wait for people to relax, basically. And eventually something good will probably happen. The other thing is, I am more than willing to put myself into photos in ways like this. I actually kind of like doing it. It's kind of maybe kind of a little kitschy, but everybody knows you're there anyway. And everybody knows you're part of the experience. You're a participant in this stuff. You're not a journalist, or at least I'm not. So I will often just let the viewer feel see what I'm seeing and feel what I'm feeling as best I can. And that can be done in any number of different ways. Again, especially as part of a larger sequence of photos, then you can do so yeah, it's fine to have the tent door in there. It adds depth. In this case, it adds color contrast between the yellow and the blue. So I play around with that. Audience participation part. How do you show motion in a photo? Who's got an idea?
Blurriness.
What's that?
Making things blurry, kind of, if you have a long exposure.
Making things blurry. Well, it's a little bit of a trick question. You can't show motion in a photo. It's a still image. You can only imply it. And you can imply it through blur. I'll get to that in a moment. This photo implies it by A, we know the kayaks move. B, the converging of a bunch of diagonal lines, the shape of the rock, the shape of the kayak, the angle of the paddle, the shape of the mountain, of the green triangular mountain in the distance. All of those are diagonal, and the diagonal wakes of the kayak. All of those are diagonal lines that are associated with motion. So when it comes to motion, the trick question was you can't show it. You can only imply it in ways that the viewer will probably understand. This uses a different set of techniques. There's no diagonal lines except for the arms, but you still get a feeling of motion out of it. Interestingly enough, the sense of motion you get is actually a little sideways from where gravity was doing here. The picture makes it look like Paul is moving left to right. He's actually moving top to bottom, but that's fine. This is where a horse was going. You can use blur. If you use blur, you almost always need the critical things to be sharp. So the arms and the paddle and the water can be blurry, but the boat, or at least a significant part of the boat, Eli's head, and the slalom gates need to be sharp. The other thing you can do is, again, you can use lines that imply motion. There's the string of jellyfish tentacles that come out of the center of the frame and move toward the viewer. Then there's a big string that move off to the left. There's a squiggly one on the right. And then there's a little kind of flip of the bell on the upper right. And those all give you a sense that this thing is moving and undulating and doing something. And here's another use of blur, frigate bird coming in for a landing. Again, blur needs to be patterned with matched with something sharp. Otherwise, everything just looks blurry. You can blur things that move really slow if you have a tripod and a cable release, like the Earth. And you can also do the other thing that people say is one of the rules of composition, which is don't put the subject in the middle of the frame. You can put the subject in the middle of the frame as long as the motion is toward the view, straight at the camera, then it can work. And you can get a sense of motion out of that. The other things you can do are use that, again, using diagonal lines as kind of the baseline of motion. Again, there's nothing moving in the frame on the left, but the bear tracks that are moving from top left to bottom left to top right, going off, and take your eye off into the distance. The pelican coming in for a landing, the kind of the curved shape of the wings, and the fact that it's at the right hand side of the frame, obviously give it a sense of motion. Case in point, this is image number one. You're gonna see two images of basically the same scene. Image number one, the person in the yellow dry suit, Janet, is looking at the lens, looking at the camera. The motion is between the camera, Janet, and the big ice pinnacle that's right behind it. So it's motion in depth only. The movement is to and from the camera. In the second image, which I consider to be far more interesting, the raft has turned slightly. Janet is looking off to the right at where we are rowing pretty hard to not get swept into an iceberg. But we can't tell what she's looking at. The raft is also turned slightly, and it's no longer, while her head is still in line between the camera and the ice pinnacle, with the gulls on it, or the pigeons, as Fred might call them. It is no longer a very symmetrical line. There's interest off the frame that makes our eye work a little harder and gives it more of a sense of motion as well as a sense of tension. Last hint I have for you goes back to some of the questions earlier that Jennifer asked about how do you set focus and how do you control it in focus. Whatever tool you're using, you're going to need to master two different machines if you really want to be able to control your images. So one of them is, again, can you selectively focus? Can you control when you want only one thing in focus, but I want the paddler to be blurry? Or do I want everything to be sharp? You're definitely going to need to be able to control exposure in contrasty situations. In situations like this, every camera, I don't care whether it is a phone or a super expensive fancy digital camera, is going to try and make the rocks light enough that the sky will be blown out, and you're going to need to know how to override it so that you can shoot in situations like this. The other one, and again, like, how do you use macro mode? What does that do to focus? How do you control that at a relatively fine level? And how do you manage blur, where you can also keep things sharp, razor sharp where you want them to be. I used to, in the days of film, I carried tripods all the time. I carry them less and less now, partly because the cameras have more capability with high ISO, but just partly because I don't want to haul them around as much. And there's and you can find inventive ways to use a miniature tripod or balance the camera on rocks or do whatever, you can find ways to do that. But you need to know how to kind of create some of those settings. Selective lighting, for sure. How do you set it up so that you'll get what you think you're going to get if you have a deer that's hanging out in your campsite with the sun right behind it. And the other machine that you're probably going to need to master at some point, or at least become reasonably competent with, and this is what happens after you shoot your photos. In this modern era, most photos really do require some sort of post-processing, whether it's just to get the water droplets off the lens, or if you do want to do black and white conversions, or if you do have something that snuck into the frame and you want to crop it out. Every image I take usually goes through a couple of minutes of fine tuning. I'm not really into photoshopping, like LeBron James's head onto Oops members when we go paddling. You can do that if you want, but really just kind of the finer points of color and contrast and dust spots and water droplets and things like that are going to take some correction. And then there's then if you want to play with black and white conversions or whatnot, you can. That is the brief spiel. So I'm going to stop sharing and people can ask questions and we can chat.
Neil, I'm curious, what kind of post-processing software do you use?
Mostly Lightroom. There's a couple of things that Photoshop does better than Lightroom, and I am by no means an expert on post-processing. I mean, I have a book that I'm gradually, but I know how to do the basics. So yeah, and those are like things you subscribe to for like $10 a month or $14 a month from Adobe. There are lots of other programs out there. Those are the ones that I use just because those are the ones that I know and I know how to use. But there are other programs, and I know that there's stuff that comes with Apple and stuff that like I remember. I think something came with one of my cameras when I bought it that I never used. But there's a lot of stuff, but that's what I use.
Neil, there's a question in the chat appreciating the Rain-X tip and wondering how do you apply it and could you go too far with it?
Yeah, you can go too far with it. I wouldn't drink it. I would not gum it up, put it on so thick that it just becomes like gooey. Like it really just takes like one drop on like a camera lens, and then you rub it around with a cloth, and you can get like the little packets of, when we went to like you can either get it in a bottle or the little packets that you can just stuff in a dry bag or things like that. What I found when you get the little packet, it has like the little Kleenex size thing in it. That little Kleenex size thing in it will happily take care of your camera lens, your binocular lens, your sunglasses, your regular glasses, and anything, and you're still going to have some left over. So it doesn't take much at all.
No more questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone's holding on to one that they want to put in there or just ask out loud. Also know we're at 8 o'clock, and so maybe.
Who won the contest to name the most locations?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, who's going to be famous? That's what we need to know. I admit I forgot to keep track of.
No worries. People who know me well that know that's my favorite game. So game, or one of my favorite games with photos. Well, yeah, that's the spiel. There's obviously a whole lot of depth on the technical side. If people want to go there, really the most important book to read there is the manual for your camera. Most of those little point and shoots have a lot more capability than most people use. So yeah.
Well, there's some thanks in the chat. I'm going to stop recording in case anyone has something that they just were like, I don't want to be on camera to ask, and just so that we're stopped in the recording. But feel free, folks, to stick around, keep asking questions.